Jacob Hale slammed the ranch gate against the easter wind. Wood cracked under his hand. The scar where a wedding ring once lived burned cold against his skin. 3 winters since the fever took his wife. 3 years of silence in the house behind him. Then wagon wheels groaned along the muddy road. A lone woman stepped down from the stage. Dusty coat, travel case, eyes searching the yard. Before Jacob could speak, a small girl ran from the pasture fence. She grabbed the stranger's hand. "Mama." Jacob felt the prairie go still, because the woman standing in his yard was the mail-order bride he never ordered, and his life was about to change forever. Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now let's get back to the trail. Jacob Hale did not move. The easter wind shoved at the ranch gate and made the loose chain rattle against the post. Mud clung thick around his boots. The little girl stood pressed to the stranger's skirt with both hands buried in the woman's travel coat, as if she had already chosen her place in the world and would not be pulled from it. "Mama," she said again, softer this time. The woman looked down at her in startled silence, then up at Jacob. She was young, not fragile. Dust from the road dulled the hem of her dress and streaked the sleeves of her coat, but she stood straight beneath it. One hand held a worn valise. The other rested light on the child's shoulder, careful, as though she feared the girl might break if touched too quickly. Jacob's jaw hardened. "You've got the wrong ranch." The stagecoach driver was already hauling himself back onto the box. He did not look interested in trouble, did not look interested in waiting. The woman glanced once at the road behind her. Empty prairie, gray sky, no house for miles but Jacob's, no shelter but his barn and cabin and the lean-to beside the corral. She reached into her coat and held out a folded paper. The edge shook in the wind. "Name's Clara Whitlock," she said. "I was sent here for Jacob Hale." Jacob did not take the paper. The little girl turned her face up to him. Rose, 3 years old and all eyes. Wisps of pale hair had come loose from the ribbon behind one ear. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. She should have been inside by the stove. Instead, she stood in the yard holding to a stranger like she had been waiting for her all winter. "I didn't send for anybody," Jacob said. The driver clicked his tongue at the horses. The team shifted. Clara looked from the coach to the sky. Rain lived in those clouds, hard rain, maybe sleet by dusk if the wind swung north. "Sir," she said, quiet but steady, "I was told there was a home here, a husband, work enough for 2 hands. I came all the way from St. Louis with that understanding." Jacob gave a short, bitter breath. "Then somebody lied to you." The coach rolled just like that, wood groaning, wheels biting mud, no apology, no backward glance. Rose watched it go with wide, solemn eyes. Clara did too, though only for a second. Then she squared herself against the empty road and the bigger emptiness left behind by it. That landed harder than Jacob wanted. A woman left in the open was trouble. A woman with nowhere to go was worse. Rose reached for Clara's hand. Clara let her take it. Jacob saw that, saw how natural it looked, saw something inside the child settle like a bird finally folding its wings. His chest went tight with anger he could not rightly place. "Rose," he said. The girl did not come. He stepped forward. She shrank closer to Clara's skirt. That small movement cut him sharper than barbed wire. "Inside," he said. Rose lowered her chin. "No." Jacob stared at her. She almost never told him no. Wind hissed through the dry grass by the fence. Somewhere behind the barn, a loose shutter banged once. Then again, Clara crouched so she was level with the girl. She did not smile too quickly, did not try to win her. "Your pa asked you," she said. Rose studied her. Then Jacob, then the cabin. but she still kept one fist in Clara's coat. Jacob raked a hand over the back of his neck and looked past them toward the darkening sky. The smell of coming rain rode the wind now, sharp, cold. It reached under the coat and found old aches in his shoulders. He snatched the folded paper from Clara's hand and opened it. A marriage broker's seal, his name, this ranch, promised union, promised domestic arrangement, promised payment already rendered by an interested party. Jacob's mouth flattened. He knew exactly who had done it. Martha Beckett in town, church widow, busy hands, busy tongue. Had looked at Rose last month while buying flour and said a child needed a woman in a house same as a stove needed fire. He had walked out before hearing the rest. Now the rest stood in his yard wearing a dust-stained coat. "I never agreed to this," he said. Clara rose slowly. "I can see that." No tears, no pleading, just a plain truth laid between them that unsettled him more than if she had wept. Rose coughed then, a small thin sound. Wind had turned the tip of her nose red. Her fingers looked stiff around Clara's hand. Jacob swore under his breath. "Get the girl inside," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. He strode toward the cabin. After a beat, he heard their steps behind him. One light, one smaller and skipping to keep up. Inside, the cabin held yesterday's chill. Ash sat gray in the stove. Jacob bent at once, fed kindling under the iron grate, struck a match and watched the flame catch. Orange light licked up through the wood. The room began to breathe again. Behind him came the rustle of Clara setting down her valise. Rose's shoes tapped softly across the floorboards. Jacob turned. The child had led Clara straight to the table beside the stove, straight to the warmest place in the room, as if she had known all along where the woman belonged. Clara removed her gloves finger by finger. Her hands were reddened from the ride, but strong, working hands. She took in the room with one sweep of her eyes. The patched curtain, the mended chair, the tiny coat hanging by the door, the silence, not prying, just seeing. Rain began against the roof in slow, hard drops. Jacob stared into the fire until the first flame became steady. "You can warm up," he said at last. "Storm'll pass by morning." Clara nodded once, and after that, she asked. Jacob looked at the child leaning against her arm like she had done it 100 times already. The cabin felt different, too full, too alive. He hated that he noticed. "After that," he said, "you leave." Rain settled over the ranch and stayed. Not a spring shower, a long gray soaking that turned the yard to churned mud and drummed on the roof until the cabin felt cut loose from the rest of the world. Jacob Hale rose before first light, always had. He pulled on his shirt in the dark, shrugged into his coat, and stepped from the bedroom with his boots in one hand so the heels would not wake Rose. The fire in the stove had fallen to a red glow, but someone had banked it right. Ash tucked careful around the coals, dry kindling stacked beside the hearth. He paused. Then he saw Clara asleep in the chair by the table, her head tipped back, one blanket over her lap and another folded around Rose, where the child lay curled against her side on a pallet of quilts. Rose's fist was still caught in the fabric of Clara's skirt. Jacob stood very still. Rain tapped at the window. Firelight breathed low and warm. For one crooked second, the room looked like something he had once known. He turned away from it hard. Outside, the cold hit clean and sharp. The barn roof hissed under the rain. Horses shifted in their stalls. A calf bawled from the lean-to where the youngest stock were kept dry. Jacob moved through the chores without wasted motion. Hay forked down. Buckets hauled. Latch fixed on the south gate where the wind had worried it loose. Work steadied him. Work always had. By the time the sky lifted from black to iron gray, his shirt clung damp to his back and steam rose faint off the horses. When he came in again, the cabin no longer smelled only of wood smoke and old coffee, bacon, biscuits, something thin and savory from a pot on the stove. Clara stood there in her shirt sleeves with an apron tied over her travel dress, as if she had belonged in that kitchen for years instead of one wet night. Her sleeves were rolled to the forearms. A loose strand of hair had come free near her temple. She had found his flour bin, his salt crock, the coffee pot, the bacon hanging in the cool cupboard. Jacob set the milk pail down harder than he meant to. "I didn't ask for this." "No," Clara said, not looking ruffled in the least. But Rose was hungry. Rose sat at the table swinging her feet, a tin cup in both hands. There was color in her face again. The child looked from one of them to the other, quiet as a field mouse. Jacob took off his hat and hung it by the door. He should have been angrier. Instead, he noticed the dishes laid ready, the table wiped clean, the chill worked out of the room. That angered him in a different way. He crossed to the wash basin. Cold water bit his fingers. He scrubbed off mud and stable smell while Clara slid biscuits from the pan. One of them split. She turned at once, reached for the crock of jam on the shelf above the stove, and knocked against a small frame tucked near the wall. It tipped. Her hand darted out and caught it before it struck the floor. Jacob straightened. The room went flat and quiet. Clara looked down. The photograph was old and fading. A woman seated stiffly in Sunday clothes. Young. Tired eyes, Rose as a baby bundled in her lap. Jacob standing behind them, broader now than then, but with the same shut mouth and watchful stare. Clara did not ask. She set the frame back where it had been, carefully, exactly. Then she stepped aside from it as if she had never touched it at all. Jacob dried his hands on a towel that did not need drying. Rose broke the silence first. "That me?" Her small finger pointed to the picture. Clara looked over. "Yes," she said softly, "that's you." "Baby." "Yes." Rose seemed pleased by that. She took a bite of biscuit and got jam on her cheek. Clara reached to wipe it. Jacob spoke before he meant to. "Leave it." Both of them looked at him. He crossed the room, crouched, and wiped Rose's cheek with his own thumb. The child leaned into the touch without thinking. That did something mean to his chest. He rose too fast. Clara lowered her eyes and turned back to the stove, but not before he saw it. Not pity, understanding. He disliked that more than pity. They ate with rain knocking at the roof and the stove ticking heat into the room. Jacob finished first. He stood and reached for his coat. "Road'll be washed bad," Clara said. "No stage is coming in weather like this." He gave a curt nod. He knew that already. "I'll ride to town when it clears." "And until then." Jacob settled his hat on his head. "You stay out of my way." It should have sounded harder than it did. He left before she could answer. The rain quit near noon. Clouds broke in torn strips over the prairie. Water dripped from the eaves. The yard shone slick and brown under a weak patch of sun. Jacob spent the afternoon at the far fence line resetting posts loosened by thaw. The work took him farther from the cabin than he needed to go. Still, when he returned with dusk, he found himself slowing at the door. Rose's laugh reached him first, a rare sound, bright enough to stop a man where he stood. Inside, the cabin glowed gold. Clara knelt beside the child on the floor with a rag doll made from one of Jacob's old work shirts. Rose was making the doll walk across the boards toward a little fort built of kindling sticks. Clara listened, as if the whole thing were a matter of grave importance. Then Rose spotted him. "Pa." She ran to him. He lifted her automatically. Mud stained the hem of her little dress. One ribbon had come loose again. She ate stew, Clara said, rising, and slept a little after dinner. Jacob nodded once. On the table sat his mending basket, not where he kept it, open, a line of neatly repaired socks folded beside it, a shirt cuff patched, Rose's torn blanket whip-stitched along one edge. He stared at the work. Clara saw, I used my own thread. He almost laughed at that, almost. Instead, he set Rose down. His eyes moved past Clara to the shelf near the stove. The photograph was there, and beside it, partly hidden by the coffee grinder, lay a woman's wedding band on a narrow strip of leather. Not his, Mary's. He had left it in the open last night without thinking, or maybe thinking too much. He did not know. Clara followed his gaze. Again, she did not ask. But later, while Rose dozed on the pallet and Night pressed close against the windows, Jacob came in from latching the barn to find Clara standing by the shelf with the lamp light warming one side of her face. Her hand hovered near the ring but did not touch it. She died in August, he said. The words came rough, uninvited, like something broken loose in a flood. Clara turned. Jacob kept his eyes on the leather thong. Fever took half the valley that year, took her faster than the doctor said it would. He swallowed once. Rose was too little to remember much. The lamp flame trembled. Outside, somewhere deep in the dark, a coyote called. Clara waited. Jacob scrubbed a hand over his jaw. Folks in town started looking at me different after, like a man alone with a child was a thing that needed fixing. His mouth hardened. I didn't ask to be fixed. No, Clara said, just that. No sermon, no careful sympathy. He finally looked at her. What do you see when you look at this place? Her eyes moved over the room. The old boards, the patched curtain, the tiny shoes by the stove, the rifle over the door, the hollowness that still lived there under the warmth. A man keeping everything standing with both hands, she said, and one of those hands is tired. Jacob's face shut. He turned away, added wood to the stove though it did not need it. Sparks snapped up orange and brief. From the pallet, Rose stirred and whimpered in her sleep. At once Clara crossed the room, knelt, and laid a hand on the child's back. The small body settled. Quiet returned. Jacob watched the shape of them in the firelight, one kneeling, one sleeping, a stillness in the room he had not known how badly it was missing until it stood before him. That was the dangerous part, not Clara herself, what her presence did. The next morning brought a hard, bright sky and a wind that scraped the mud dry in ridges. Jacob saddled the bay gelding before sunup. Town waited 6 miles east. So did Martha Beckett and the marriage broker she'd likely written, and whatever explanation they thought a man owed them after sending a stranger to his land. He came around the side of the barn leading the horse and found Clara at the clothesline stringing washed garments between 2 posts, not just hers, Rose's little stockings, Jacob's work shirts. She had taken water from the pump and scrubbed them in the cold while the rest of the place still slept. The sight annoyed him for reasons that made no sense. You're leaving the child alone. Rose is gathering eggs, Clara said. As if on cue, the girl emerged from the henhouse carrying one basket with both hands and a look of fierce concentration. Jacob stepped forward fast. Rose made it 3 paces before catching a boot in a rut. The basket tipped. Clara moved first, swift as a striking bird, and caught both child and eggs before either hit the ground. Only one cracked. Rose stared at the broken shell in horror. Clara crouched. It happens, she said. We save what we can. Rose's mouth wobbled, then steadied. Jacob took the basket from them and set it safe on the porch rail. His pulse had kicked hard from that near fall, too hard. He looked at Clara. "You've done farm work." "I've done what was needed." "Where?" She straightened. "Missouri first, then Kansas." A pause, then wherever work held long enough to buy the next ticket west. That was more road than most decent women traveled alone. The thought crossed his face before he could stop it, because Clara's chin lifted. "You may ask it plain, Mr. Hale." He said nothing, so she did. "My father drank, my brothers gambled. When the farm was sold, there wasn't much left for me except kitchens that paid in scraps and houses where men thought wages included touching what wasn't theirs." Her voice stayed level. "I chose the mail-order bureau because paper looked safer than hunger." Jacob stood with the horse reins in one hand and no answer ready. The wind snapped a shirt on the line. Rose came to stand by Clara's skirt without seeming to think about it. That small gesture made Jacob feel accused, though no one had said a word. He cleared his throat. "You're not staying permanent." "I know. Town Road may still be passable. And if no stage comes." He looked toward the eastern rise where the road cut over the prairie. Clouds were building again, thin at first, more behind them. Spring in these parts could turn mean in an hour. He knew it, she knew it, and there was Rose, always Rose. Clara brushed straw from the child's hair. "I can work," she said, "until the next coach, or until you find some other arrangement. I don't need charity." Jacob's grip tightened on the reins. He hated the sense in it, hated more that she had offered terms like a business hand instead of begging. What kind of work? Cooking, washing, chickens, garden when the ground warms, books if you keep any worth keeping. I can sew, I can stretch flour, I can doctor a child through a cough if it's nothing worse. A small pause, and I know when to keep quiet. The last line hit him clean. He glanced at Rose. The child was studying a ladybug on the porch post as if the whole future did not hang on adult decisions over her head. Jacob looked back at Clara. 1 month, he said. The words seemed to land in the yard like fence posts sunk deep. Clara did not smile. That oddly made it easier. 1 month until the next through stage, he went on. You work, you eat, you keep to the house and yard, no talk in town, no claims, no confusion for the child. Rose looked up at the word child, then at Clara, then at him. Clara's face softened only at the edges. 1 month, she said. Jacob nodded once. The agreement should have settled things. Instead, a strange unease moved through him, as if he had not closed a door but opened one. He mounted up. From the saddle, the ranch looked different than it had yesterday. Clara at the line, pinning clean shirts into the wind. Rose beside her with one tiny hand wrapped around the woman's skirt. Smoke lifting from the chimney in a straight pale ribbon. Home, too much like home. Jacob turned the gelding toward town before that thought could root. As he rode out, a wagon approached from the east. Not close enough yet to make out the driver. Just a dark shape on the road and a shine of iron rims in the sun. Jacob felt his shoulders go tight. Pressure had a way of traveling before it showed its face. Behind him, the ranch sat warm in the morning light. Ahead, something colder was coming. By the time Jacob rode back from town, the sun had dropped low and red behind the western ridge. Dust lay pale over his boots. Silence rode home with him. The dark wagon he had seen on the road that morning had belonged to no one he knew, just a feed merchant heading west. But town had brought other things. Martha Beckett had folded her hands and looked righteous. Said she meant well. Said a child needed softness in a house. Said the broker had assured her Clara Whitlock was respectable, skilled, church-raised, and in need of an honest start. Jacob had said very little. That was usually when people heard him best. He had also heard other talk, low voices outside the mercantile. A ranch east of Miller's Creek pressed over some old note. A widow in town told to sell before legal men made it worse. Crowley's name had not been spoken loud. Men did not speak it loud unless they had money enough to be careless. Now Jacob saw smoke lifting from his chimney and felt that same tightness return between his shoulders. He dismounted at the rail. The yard looked different again, not polished, not fancy, lived in. A wash tub leaned upside down to dry beside the porch. Split kindling sat stacked in even rows by the wall. Rose's little shoes rested under the bench, side by side instead of thrown where they landed. Inside, the cabin held warmth and the smell of onion and rabbit stew. Clara stood at the table with her sleeves rolled, slicing carrots thin with Jacob's old butcher knife. Rose sat on a stool near the stove peeling potatoes badly and with grave concentration. The child looked up first. Pa. Just that, but there was ease in it. Jacob took off his hat. Clara did not ask about town, that suited him. He washed at the basin, sat when the bowls were placed out, ate without comment. The stew was better than his own. He disliked noticing that too. Rose, drowsy with heat and supper, leaned against his arm while he ate, then leaned away to show him a crooked little potato peel she had made. Long one. He glanced at it. She smiled anyway. Across the table, Clara kept her eyes on her own bowl, yet he could feel that she noticed the child's small pride, noticed his answer, noticed the room learning a new shape around the three of them. After the meal, Jacob rose to take the kettle to the stove. Clara reached for the bowls at the same time, their hands brushed. A quick thing, nothing, but both of them stilled. Then Jacob set the kettle down harder than needed and stepped back. I'll do the outside latch. Clara only nodded. He went out into the cooling dusk with more force than the chore required. The evening was soft after rain. Frogs had started up near the low ground. Horses breathed slow in the barn. The sky held a thin wash of pink above the black line of cottonwoods. Jacob checked the gate, the stock, the wagon tongue. He circled wider than necessary, giving the house time to settle behind him. When he finally stepped back onto the porch, he heard singing. Quiet, nearly under the breath. Not performance, habit. A hymn maybe, or something close to one. Inside, Clara knelt beside Rose's pallet, smoothing the blanket after tucking the child in. The lamplight made soft gold of the loose hair at Clara's neck. Rose's eyes were already shut. One hand still held the rag doll. Jacob stopped in the doorway. Clara rose and turned the lamp wick down a little. She was tired. Jacob nodded once. Then his eyes moved across the room. The old rocker by the stove had been shifted closer to the fire. Mary used to keep it there in cold weather. For a moment his chest locked. He crossed the room and set the rocker back against the wall, too quickly. The wood legs scraped the boards. Clara looked at him, not offended, not confused. She understood at once that something unseen had been stepped on. I can put it back in the morning, she said. Jacob kept his back to her. No. One word, flat. He stood there a second longer, hands still on the chair back. Then he let go and went into the bedroom, closing the door a little harder than he meant. Morning came bright and windless. The kind of spring morning that fooled a man into thinking hardship had passed. Clara was already outside when Jacob emerged from the barn after first chores. She had tied her skirts up practical and plain and was at the chicken run with a bucket of scraps in one hand. Rose waddled beside her, carrying a much smaller pail with both fists. The hens clucked and rushed the fence. Rose laughed. Jacob paused with a saddle blanket over one shoulder. Clara glanced toward him but did not stop what she was doing. She moved with purpose. No wasted reaching, no fuss. She checked the water trough for the hens, gathered eggs into her apron, noticed one loose board in the run and wedged a stone against it before any bird could test it. Useful, he had thought before. Now he saw how useful. By noon she had kneaded bread, aired quilts, and somehow talked Rose into letting her comb the knots from her hair without tears. Jacob found them on the porch afterward, Clara dividing dry beans into a bowl while Rose sorted pebbles from them with toddler seriousness. The child looked cleaner, calmer. The house behind them looked the same and not the same. Jacob carried in a sack of feed. Clara rose to make room. "You're low on flour," she said. He set the sack down. "I know." "And lamp oil." He gave her a look. She did not flinch. "I made a list," she said, and pointed to a scrap of paper near the salt crock. Jacob did not pick it up. "Don't manage me." "I'm managing the house you said I could work in." That should have angered him. Instead it caught him, because she was right. Rose, sensing the edge in the air, went very still over her beans. Jacob saw that, exhaled through his nose, took the paper, 3 things on it: flour, oil, soap, no extra wants, no pretty foolishness. He folded the scrap once and put it in his pocket. That was answer enough. The days began to find a rhythm after that. Not easy, never easy, but a rhythm. Jacob worked fence and stock from dawn to late afternoon. Clara kept the cabin, chickens, and small order of daily survival stitched together with steady hands. Rose moved between them like a little thread pulling loose spaces closed. At supper the child would recount solemn discoveries: a beetle shell under the porch, a crooked egg, a cloud that looked like a sheep. Clara listened as if each thing mattered. Jacob mostly listened in silence, but sometimes Rose would look to him for agreement, and he would give a nod or a grunt or one brief sentence, and each time the child lit from the inside. One evening Clara mended a tear in Jacob's work coat while he sat near the stove sharpening a harness buckle. The fire snapped. Wind pressed softly at the eaves. Rose slept already. Clara held the coat up to check her stitching. This seam was nearly gone. Jacob looked over. "So mend it." "I did." He grunted. A beat passed. Then Clara said, "You don't like needing anyone." Jacob kept the whetstone moving across the metal. "No. Even when the needing is small." He set the buckle down. Small things don't stay small. That quieted the room. Clara lowered the coat to her lap. She seemed to weigh the words instead of defending herself against them. Outside, a coyote barked from far off. Inside, the stove let off a slow iron tick. At last Clara said, "Sometimes they do." Jacob did not answer, because if he did, he might say something truer than he wanted. 2 mornings later, the weather shifted. Cloud cover came in from the north, thin at first, then thick. Wind carried a dry bite that had no business lingering this late in spring. Jacob was in the west pasture repairing a broken rail when he saw Rose running from the yard with the rag doll flapping from one hand. Too far, too fast. He dropped the hammer at once. Rose. The child startled and stumbled in the grass. Before Jacob could reach her, Clara was there from the garden patch, skirts hitched, boots thudding earth. She scooped Rose up before the little girl could fall into the shallow washout near the fence. Rose burst into tears more from fright than hurt. Jacob arrived a breath later, anger and fear colliding so hard they almost felt the same. What was she doing out here alone? Clara held the child against her shoulder until the crying eased. I turned to pull one weed. She slipped past. "That's not watching." Clara's face changed then, not wounded. "Steadier than that." "No," she said, "it is." Jacob reached for Rose. The little girl came to him, hiccuping softly, one damp cheek pressed to his coat. He held her too tight for a second, then eased. Clara stood there in the wind, dirt smudged at one knee, hands empty now. Jacob saw the way she stayed where she was instead of stepping in to soothe him, saw the restraint in that, the respect. His anger cooled enough to leave shame behind. Rose's fingers played with the edge of his collar. "I sorry, Pa." He swallowed. "You stay near the house." She nodded against him. Jacob looked at Clara. She had already bent to retrieve the child's dropped rag doll from the grass. When she handed it over, their eyes met. "I'll watch closer," she said. He wanted to say he knew. Wanted to say he had been angry because fear had got there first, but those were not the words a man like Jacob Hale let loose easy, so he only nodded. That night he added an extra hook and eye latch higher on the porch gate where Rose could not reach it. Clara handed him nails without comment. The small silence between them had changed, not warmer exactly, but more honest. A day later, the threat came closer. Jacob rode into town for supplies with Clara's scrap list folded in his pocket and unease sitting with him in the saddle. Main Street was mud and wagon ruts. Men stood outside the mercantile speaking low, not the easy talk of weather or stock prices. Something pinched ran under it. Inside, the storekeeper filled Jacob's flour order slower than usual. Then leaned his elbows on the counter. "You hear about the Benson place?" Jacob shook his head once. "Taken." "By who?" The man glanced toward the front window, though no one stood there. "Paper men. Claim says old debt. Widow swore she paid most of it off. Didn't matter." Sheriff rode out with two fellows from Crowley's office. Jacob's mouth flattened. The storekeeper slid the lamp oil forward. "They say he's buying up half this side of the valley, through liens, notes, technicalities. Men sign one thing in winter and lose pasture by spring." Jacob said nothing, but he felt the old hardening begin in his spine. On the ride home, the sky went dark early. By the time he reached his own gate, the wind had turned sharp again. Clara met him on the porch before he could unload. Not anxious, alert, there was a rider here. Jacob stilled with one flour sack in his arms. "When?" "An hour ago." "What he want?" He didn't say much, only asked if this was Hale land, looked the place over like he was measuring it with his eyes. Rose stood just inside the door, thumb near her mouth, watching them. Jacob set the sack down. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that you were in town." Clara's jaw tightened. He smiled at that. Jacob felt something cold move under his ribs. He took the rest of the supplies inside, then went back out and walked the property edge before dark. No tracks he could trust. Wind had worried most of them thin. At supper he ate little. Rose sensed it and stayed close to Clara's side. The child's chatter was absent. Only spoon sounds, stove hiss, the occasional thump of wind at the wall. After Rose was asleep, Jacob laid the receipts and one folded county notice on the table. Clara, wiping down the counter, looked over. He did not mean to show her, but he did not hide it either. She stepped nearer. The notice bore county marks and language meant to sound polite while drawing blood. Boundary review, tax discrepancy, recorded inquiry regarding title history. Clara read only enough to understand. "Is it serious?" Jacob rubbed a thumb over the paper edge. "Could be nothing." But he did not sound like he believed it. Clara's eyes lifted to him, "And if it isn't nothing?" He looked toward the dark window, where only the lamp reflections stared back. "Then a man with money has found a way to knock without using his fist." The cabin seemed smaller after that. The fire still gave heat, the lamp still burned, Rose still slept soft on her pallet, yet the warmth had a border now, and outside pressing in. Clara turned the notice over once, then laid it flat again. Her fingers rested on the table near his, not touching. "What do you need done tomorrow?" Jacob looked at her, not the question he expected, not comfort, not fear, work, practical, steady, forward. He thought of the hens, the garden patch, the child, the house, the fence line, the rider measuring his land with his eyes. "Keep Rose near," he said. "I will." He nodded toward the papers. "And don't mention this in town." "I won't." Another pause. Then Clara added, "If pressure's coming, better the home stays standing." Home, she said it plain, not as a claim, as a fact of labor, a thing held together by whoever refused to let it fall apart. Jacob looked at the room, at the mended coat hanging by the door, at Rose's little shoes by the stove, at Clara's folded hands resting on the rough table. He had meant this arrangement to be temporary, 1 month, a clean span, a counted thing, but the days were no longer passing like strangers. They were taking root, and now something beyond the gate had noticed. Outside, the wind lifted. Somewhere in the darkness, a loose chain tapped the post in slow metallic beats, like a warning, like time running down. The wind shifted 2 days later, a dry wind. one that carried dust and the smell of distant sage instead of spring damp. Jacob noticed it before sunrise while he checked the west fence. The horses were restless, not panicked, just uneasy in the way stock sometimes were when something unseen had passed through the land. He worked the fence anyway, hammer, nail, post. The rhythm kept his mind straight, but something Clara had said the night before kept circling back. If pressure's coming, better the home stays standing, not a frightened woman's thought, a thinking one. When Jacob returned to the cabin near noon, he found the door open and papers spread across the table. Not Clara's things, his, old ledgers, land receipts, a faded map of the original homestead boundary. Clara stood over them with a pencil tucked behind her ear and flour on her hands. She had been baking. Rose sat nearby with a spoon and a tin cup, making slow, important circles in spilled flour. Jacob stopped in the doorway. Clara looked up. "You keep records," she said. "Enough." "More than enough." Jacob crossed the room slowly. "Those aren't for sorting. They're for surviving." She tapped one of the older papers. "Your original land claim is older than the county record they filed last year." Jacob's eyes narrowed. Meaning someone copied the boundary wrong when the courthouse refiled the map. She slid the old parchment beside the newer county notice. The difference was small. A line shifted half a mile south, small on paper. But that line cut straight across Jacob's water rights and pasture. Rose banged the spoon against the table leg. Clara absently steadied the cup before it tipped. Jacob leaned over the documents. "Clerks make mistakes." "Yes," Clara said, "but men with money sometimes help those mistakes along." Silence held for a moment. Jacob studied the line again, then the county stamp, then the filing date. His jaw hardened. "That writer wasn't measuring land," Clara said quietly. "He was measuring how much trouble you'd make." Rose suddenly held up something she had drawn in the flour with the spoon. "Horse." It was a crooked circle with 4 lines. Jacob looked at it, then at Clara. The child had interrupted something heavy without knowing. Clara wiped Rose's hand clean with a cloth and smiled at the drawing, but Jacob could see the thought still moving behind her eyes. "You know how to read land records?" he asked. "My father used to cheat men in card games," Clara said. "I learned early how paper steals faster than guns." Jacob almost smiled. Almost. He folded the old map carefully and slid it back into the stack. "Town council meets Fridays." "That's 3 days. Long enough for a man like Crowley to move faster." Clara nodded once. Rose climbed onto Jacob's boot and balanced there like a tiny rider, horse. He lifted her without comment. For a moment, the weight of her steadied something in him. Then a sound came from outside, a distant crack, not thunder. Jacob's head lifted. Then came another sound. Cattle running. Jacob set Rose down at once. Clara was already moving. The yard erupted with dust and hooves. 3 steers burst through the far fence line, bawling and wild-eyed. Jacob swore under his breath and ran. The fence post lay snapped, not weathered, cut. He saw it in one glance, fresh blade marks. 2 riders were already disappearing over the ridge, not rushing, just leaving, like men who knew the damage had been done. Jacob's fists tightened. The steers scattered across the pasture. He spent the next hour riding them down and turning them back toward the corral. When he finally returned to the yard, sweat darkened his shirt and dust clung to his boots. Clara stood near the porch with Rose tucked behind her skirt. What happened? Jacob dismounted hard. Fence was cut. "An accident." "No." Rose peeked around Clara's leg. "Bad men." Jacob did not answer, but the child saw enough in his face. That night the wind rose, the kind that whistled under doors and pressed against the roof like a hand trying to push its way inside. Jacob sat at the table sharpening his knife. Clara mended a torn feed sack. Neither spoke much. Rose slept. The quiet was not peaceful, it was waiting. The next morning the strike came harder. Jacob found the well first. The bucket rope hung loose, too loose. He leaned over the stones. The bucket lay split at the bottom. Someone had dropped a rock through it. Water soaked the ground where it had spilled uselessly into the dirt. Jacob stood there a long moment. Behind him, Clara approached slowly. "Can it be fixed?" "Everything can be fixed." His voice was flat, but his eyes had gone colder. They worked most of the morning repairing the bucket and resetting the pulley. Rose sat nearby playing with sticks in the dust. The sky grew heavy with clouds again. Just past noon, a new sound came from the road. Hoofbeats, slow, deliberate. Jacob wiped his hands and turned. The rider approached alone, well-dressed. Black coat, wide hat. The horse beneath him, expensive and calm. Victor Crowley did not look like a man who had ridden hard. He looked like a man who owned the road. He stopped just outside the gate. His eyes moved over the ranch, the barn, the repaired fence, the cabin, Clara, then Rose. His smile was small and thin. Jacob Hale. Jacob stepped forward, but did not open the gate. Crowley. The wind shifted dust between them. Crowley rested one hand lightly on the saddle horn. "I hear there's some confusion over your land papers." Jacob said nothing. Crowley continued calmly. "Clerical matters can become expensive if not handled early." "Then fix your clerk." Crowley chuckled softly. "I admire stubborn men, Mr. Hale." His eyes drifted again to the house, to a point. Rose stepped out from behind Clara. "Who that?" Clara pulled the child gently back. Crowley watched the motion with interest. "You've acquired company." "Temporary." "Everything is temporary," Crowley said. Then he leaned slightly forward in the saddle. "My advice is simple. Sell the land while it still holds value." Jacob crossed his arms. "Not for sale." Crowley studied him, then nodded slowly. "Well." His horse shifted once. "I did warn the Bensons too." Jacob's jaw tightened. Crowley turned the horse. Before riding away, he said one last thing. "Storms are coming to this valley, Mr. Hale." The rider disappeared over the rise. Silence followed. Clara let out a slow breath. That was him. Jacob nodded. Rose tugged Clara's sleeve. "Mean man." Clara crouched beside her. "Yes." The afternoon passed in uneasy quiet. Jacob checked the stock twice, then 3 times. The sky darkened early. The storm Crowley mentioned rolled in fast, wind first, then rain. By nightfall the ranch shook under it. Inside the cabin the fire burned bright. Rose slept wrapped in 2 quilts. Clara poured coffee while Jacob stood near the door listening to the storm. Then a new sound cut through the wind, a hoarse scream. Jacob was outside before Clara could speak. Lightning split the sky. The corral gate hung open. One horse was gone, the others were panicked. Jacob grabbed the lantern and ran toward the pasture. Tracks cut across the mud. Fresh, boot marks, not just theft. Message. By the time he returned to the cabin, soaked with rain and fury simmering behind his eyes, Clara was waiting by the door. They took one. Jacob nodded once. "Crowley. Or men who want me thinking about him." The storm hammered the roof harder. Rose stirred in her sleep. Clara looked toward the child, then back to Jacob. "What will you do?" Jacob hung the lantern on the hook. Water dripped from his coat. His voice came low. "I'm done waiting." The fire snapped in the stove. Outside, thunder rolled across the prairie. And somewhere in the dark beyond the ranch fence, the men who had started the trouble believed the quiet rancher would keep swallowing it. They were about to learn otherwise. Before dawn, Jacob Hale was already in the barn. Lantern lights swung over stall walls and harness pegs. Rainwater still dripped from the brim of his hat onto the packed dirt floor. He cinched the saddle with hard, exact pulls. No wasted motion, no hesitation. The bay gelding stamped once and tossed its head, feeling the iron in the man above it. Jacob's rifle rested across the workbench. His knife rode his belt. His jaw looked carved from the same dark wood as the stall posts. Behind him came the soft scrape of boots. Clara stood in the doorway with Rose wrapped in a quilt against her shoulder. The child's hair was mussed from sleep. One small hand rested open on Clara's collarbone. The barn air held hay, damp leather, horse breath. Clara looked at the empty stall where the stolen horse should have been, then at Jacob. "You found tracks." "Enough. Enough to follow." He took the rifle and checked the chamber, enough to make a man talk. Rose stirred and blinked at him through sleep-heavy eyes. "Pa goin'." Jacob stepped close and touched one knuckle to her cheek. "Town." The child's fingers caught the edge of his sleeve before letting go. Clara shifted Rose higher. "Crowley wants you angry." Jacob settled the rifle into its scabbard. "He's got that already." Then he stopped with one boot in the stirrup and looked back at them. The barn door framed both of them in the first thin blue of morning. Clara in the same plain dress she wore for work. Rose wrapped close in the quilt. Holmes standing there. "Not the cabin, not the land, them." His voice came lower than before. "Keep the door barred." Clara nodded once. "I will. If any rider comes, you do open." "I know." Jacob mounted and rode out before the light fully broke. The prairie lay wide and pale under a sky still bruised from the storm. He found the tracks where the mud kept them. One stolen horse, 2 riders, headed east toward town, then veering south at Miller's Creek where the cottonwoods thickened. Jacob followed without hurry. Anger was no good if it outran a man's eyes. At the creek crossing he found the horse, tied in the brush. Saddle gone. Branding blanket thrown over its back to hide the mark. Not a theft for profit, a theft for warning. Jacob loosened the knot and ran his hand over the animal's neck. The horse shivered but stood. Near the tree roots lay a broken matchbox with the mercantile stamp from town burned into the lid, and boot prints, one with a worn heel cut crooked on the left side. Jacob had seen that heel before outside Crowley's office. He remembered things like that. He led the horse back toward town instead of home. Dust had begun to rise on Main Street by the time he rode in with both reins in hand. Men saw him coming, saw the second horse, saw his face. Talk thinned in front of the barber and stopped entirely by the mercantile porch. Jacob tied both horses hard outside the sheriff's office and went in without knocking. Sheriff Tom Weller sat behind a desk that looked too small for him. Thick shoulders, white in the mustache. Tired eyes that had seen too many men excuse themselves with money. Weller looked at Jacob, then at the mud on his boots, then at the second set of reins in his fist. Morning. Jacob dropped the broken matchbox onto the desk. "They took my horse." Weller did not touch the box yet. "Who?" "Crowley's men." "Which men?" Jacob's stare did not move. One with a crooked left heel, one with a scar under the chin. Same 2 that rode with your deputy to the Benson place. That shifted something in the sheriff's face. Not surprise, recognition. He reached for the box and turned it over once. "You see 'em?" "No." "You got proof?" "I got my horse hidden in creek brush under a branding blanket." Jacob leaned one hand on the desk. "How much more proof you waiting on, Tom?" The sheriff sat back. Outside, a wagon rattled past. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and quit. Weller set the box down. Town council's sitting this afternoon on land petitions. Jacob's eyes narrowed. "Crowley there?" "He will be." "Good." The sheriff looked at him long. "Don't turn my street into a shooting ground." Jacob straightened. "Then don't let him turn my home into a grave." He left the office with the same hard calm he'd brought in. From across the street, Martha Beckett watched from beneath her bonnet, troubled hands knotted at her waist. 2 ranchers by the feed store looked away when Jacob's eyes met theirs. That told him as much as words. Fear had already spread. Crowley had been pressing more than one man. Jacob spent the next hour moving through town like a blade through cloth. Short stops, short questions. At the blacksmith he found the crooked-heeled rider had reset a shoe 3 days prior. At the livery he learned Crowley's men had been riding after dark all week. At the recorder's office, the clerk turned pale when Jacob laid the original boundary map on the desk and asked for the refiling ledger. The clerk fumbled, sweated. produced a book with one page torn at the edge and ink entries written over older scrape marks. Jacob said little, but he saw Clara had been right. Paper steals faster than guns. By noon, he rode home with the sheriff's promise to attend the council meeting and a copy of the altered entry tucked in his coat. The ranch came into view under hard white sunlight. Clara was in the yard splitting kindling with Jacob's small hatchet. Not pretty work, real work. Rose stood on the porch handing sticks one at a time into a neat stack. When Clara saw him, her shoulders eased only a little. Jacob dismounted and led both horses in. "You found him," she said. He nodded. Rose clapped once. "Pa won." Jacob almost smiled at that. Not yet. Clara's gaze moved to his face, then the papers in his hand. "You have something. Enough to make noise." Inside, he spread the copied ledger page, the old boundary map, and the county notice on the table. Clara dried her hands and came close. Rose climbed onto a chair to see, though the papers meant nothing to her except that grown-ups had gone serious again. Jacob pointed to the scrape marks under the ink. Clark altered the line. Clara bent lower, or someone altered it for him. Jacob gave a small nod. "The sheriff's coming to the hearing. Will he stand with you?" "He'll stand where truth forces him." That was not certainty, but it was more than Jacob had yesterday. Clara traced the air above the page without touching it. If Crowley pushed the boundary false, he may have pushed the debt notices too. Jacob looked at her. "Benson's. And others." Rose poked a finger at the map. "That house." Clara lifted the child gently back from the table. "No, sweetheart, that's land." Rose seemed satisfied enough with that and returned to her sticks. Jacob watched Clara a second longer. "You coming to town?" Her eyes rose to his. "If you want the truth read straight, yes." He studied her face. Not fear, not eagerness either. Steadiness. That settled it. "You and Rose ride in the wagon, stay close to me." Clara nodded once. That afternoon the town hall filled before the meeting even started. Ranchers in work coats, widows with folded hands, storekeepers pretending they had business nearby. The room smelled of dust, wool, sweat, and lamp oil, though it was still daylight. Crowley stood near the front, black coat clean as Sunday, one gloved hand resting on the back of a chair. He turned when Jacob entered, saw Clara, saw Rose on her hip, smiled that thin smile again. Jacob felt the room, noticed the arrangement. The woman, the child, the rancher who had once kept to himself, now walking in with something to protect. Sheriff Weller took a place against the side wall. The recorder's clerk avoided everyone's eyes. When the council chairman called the matter of Jacob Hale's land inquiry, Crowley stepped forward smooth as a preacher. "A regrettable confusion," he said. "No one wishes hardship on a working man. We simply require legal clarity." Jacob said nothing yet. Crowley held up the county copy of the boundary map. According to the filed line, Mr. Hale's western water access crosses disputed acreage now under separate claim. Murmurs moved through the room. Jacob walked forward, set the original map beside Crowley's copy, then the scraped ledger page, then the broken matchbox. Each thing landed with its own sound on the long wooden table. He still did not speak. Clara did. Her voice was clear and even enough to cut the room without rising. "The original homestead grant is older than the refiled county map by 17 years. The ledger page shows scraping beneath the new entry. Someone removed the first line and wrote in another." The clerk made a sound in his throat. Crowley's eyes sharpened. The chairman frowned down at the papers. Sheriff Weller stepped off the wall at last. "Recorder," he said, "you care to explain the scrape marks?" The clerk swallowed, hands trembling. "I only wrote what I was told." Crowley turned his head slowly. That one motion carried more threat than shouting. The clerk saw it too, and broke. "Mr. Crowley said the line needed correcting, said the old entry was unclear." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "He said nobody would challenge it, not poor ranchers, not widows." The room changed then, not loud at first, just a shift, the sound of people taking truth into themselves. Crowley's voice dropped colder. "You're a weak man, Edwin." Sheriff Weller moved closer. "And you're about done talking." But Clara was not finished. She drew another paper from her satchel, a copied debt ledger from the recorder's office, 3 names marked for seizure, 1 paid in full, 1 nearly paid, 1 transferred after death to a widow who had never signed the note, the Benson place among them. She laid it beside the others. "Not confusion," she said, "pattern." Now the murmurs broke wider. Men looked at one another. Mrs. Benson herself rose from the second row, face pale but chin high. "He told me my husband's mark bound me," she said. Another rancher stood. "Crowley's clerk came to me in January with the same talk." Then another and another. Fear once one man's private burden became public. That was the crack money hated most. Crowley saw it happening and lost the smile. For the first time, Jacob watched control slip from the man's face. Just a little, enough. Crowley straightened. All of this comes from a drifter woman and a grieving rancher too stubborn to read a contract. Jacob moved then, 1 step, nothing wild, nothing reckless, but the room felt it. His voice came low and hard enough that nobody missed a word. "You sent men to my land." "Silence, you cut my fence." "Another step, you smashed my well bucket." Crowley's jaw tightened. "You stole my horse." Sheriff Weller laid a hand on Crowley's arm before the man could turn away. "Did you?" Crowley looked at the sheriff, then the room, then the clerk shaking at the side wall, then the gathered faces no longer willing to look down. His power had lived in private fear. Here, in daylight, under witness, it began to rot. He pulled his arm free. "I'll be speaking with my attorney." The chairman slammed his hand on the table. "You'll be speaking here first." By sundown, Crowley was not in a cell. Men like him rarely fell so neatly, but the county froze his claims. The recorder signed an affidavit. The sheriff took statements, and Main Street watched Victor Crowley ride out with no hat tip and no thin smile left for anyone. Dust followed him east. No one called after him, no one had to. The town hall emptied slowly. People spoke to Jacob now, not the shallow talk of weather, real talk, handshakes. Mrs. Benson touched Clara's sleeve and thanked her with wet eyes. Martha Beckett wept openly and said she had never meant harm. Jacob only nodded and let her words blow past. Outside, late light pooled gold on the boards of the porch. Rose stood between Jacob and Clara, holding one hand of each, without seeming to know she was doing it. The child looked up at him, "Bad man gone." Jacob looked down at her, then toward the road where Crowley had vanished. "For now." Rose accepted that and leaned against his leg. Clara did not pull her hand away, neither did Jacob. They rode home in the wagon under a sky washed clean after trouble. The wheels turned steady. Rose fell asleep with her head in Clara's lap before they reached the creek crossing. Jacob drove with both hands on the reins and the evening wind on his face. The valley looked the same. Fences, grass, distant smoke. Yet something had changed, not just the land, him. At the gate he climbed down first and lifted Rose carefully from the wagon. The child curled against his shoulder without waking. Clara gathered the papers and followed him to the porch. The cabin door opened to firelight and the smell of yesterday's bread still faint in the room. Warmth, quiet, no rider at the fence, no threat in the yard. Jacob laid Rose on her pallet and drew the blanket to her chin. When he turned, Clara was standing by the stove, one hand resting on the chair back, watching the room as if seeing it new. He set the recovered papers on the shelf, the original map, the ledger copy, proof that the place still belonged to him, but that was not what filled his chest. He looked at Clara. "You were right." She tilted her head a little. "About what?" "Paper." A faint, tired smile touched her mouth. "It steals fast." Jacob gave one short breath that was almost a laugh. Then the sound faded. The quiet between them deepened, not empty now, full. He looked toward Rose sleeping, then back at Clara. "When Crowley looked at the house," he said, "I didn't care what he wanted from me." Clara stayed still, Jacob's voice lowered. I cared what he might do to you both. The words hung there, plain, hard-earned, true. Clara's eyes softened, but she did not rush to fill the silence after them. That was one of the things about her. She knew when a moment needed room. Outside, the last light slipped from the yard. Inside, the fire settled into a steady red glow. Jacob stood in that warmth and felt the shape of the truth take hold. He had stepped out of isolation, had stood in public, had let the town see what mattered to him. And he had not done it for land alone. He had done it for the little girl asleep by the stove, for the woman standing in his house like she had carried light into it one careful day at a time. The reckoning was over, but something quieter had begun. Spring settled over the valley like a long breath finally released. Grass climbed back through the brown earth. Creek water ran clear instead of angry, and the Hale ranch woke each morning to the quiet sounds of work instead of worry. Jacob was in the pasture before sunrise, driving the last posts into the repaired west fence. The hammer struck steady, metal on iron, wood into earth. The fence stood stronger now than before the riders cut it. Jacob liked things that way. Rose sat nearby on an overturned bucket with a biscuit in one hand and a stick in the other. She had drawn crooked lines in the dust and was talking to the stick as if it were a horse. Go slow, she told it. The small voice carried across the pasture. Jacob worked without looking up. But the corner of his mouth shifted once. Behind them, the ranch house door opened. Clara stepped out with a basket of washed clothes balanced against her hip. Morning light caught the loose strands of hair near her temples. She watched them a moment before walking toward the lines stretched between two cottonwoods. The wind moved soft through the cloth as she pinned each shirt in place. Jacob noticed the rhythm without meaning to. Cloth, pin, cloth, pin. The simple order of a house held together by quiet hands. Rose saw her first. Mama. The word came bright and certain. Clara turned. Rose jumped off the bucket and ran across the grass. The child wrapped both arms around Clara's waist. Jacob's hammer stopped Medea. For a moment he only stood there. Clara rested a hand on Rose's hair. Not correcting the word, not questioning it, just accepting it like sunlight, Jacob drove the last nail. The fence post held firm. Later, near midday, the wagon from town arrived. Sheriff Weller climbed down slow, dusting his coat. He carried a small folded packet in one hand. Jacob met him at the gate. All settled, Weller said. Crowley left the county last night, claims withdrawn. He handed over the packet. Inside were the corrected land papers with the proper boundary stamped clean. Jacob studied the document only a second before folding it again. Thank you. Weller looked toward the house where Clara and Rose sat on the porch shelling peas into a tin bowl. Seems the ranch gained more than land this spring. Jacob did not answer right away. Finally he said, seems that way. The sheriff nodded once and rode off without further talk. By evening, the valley turned gold. Clara stood in the kitchen stirring a pot while the window glowed with sunset. Rose sat at the table drawing circles on scrap paper. Jacob stepped in from the yard carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He set it on the table. Clara looked up. What's that? Jacob unwrapped the cloth slowly. Inside lay a simple silver ring, not ornate, not new, but strong. He turned it once between his fingers before speaking. Mary's ring stayed where it belongs. He nodded toward the small leather cord still hanging beside the photograph on the shelf. This one's for the future. Clara stood very still. Rose looked up from her drawing. Pretty. Jacob rested the ring on the table between them. He did not kneel, did not make a speech, just met Clara's eyes. You've worked this ranch like it was already yours. Silence held for a breath, thought maybe it ought to be. Clara looked from the ring to the child beside her, then back to Jacob. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods. Inside, the stove ticked warm and steady. At last, Clara stepped closer. Her voice was soft. Are you asking for help with the work, Jacob Hale? He gave the faintest hint of a smile. I'm asking for the life that comes with it. Rose clapped her hands. Clara slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit. That night the ranch house glowed with firelight and the quiet sounds of a family settling into its place. Rose slept between two steady heartbeats. The wind outside no longer sounded lonely. And Jacob Hale, a man who once believed his life had ended with a grave behind the barn, sat on the porch, watching the stars rise over land that was finally, truly home. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help this old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matter. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.